Welcome to the fifth session in our series. And in this session we'll be considering liberation and the communion of love, the land, the experience beyond the desert and the dark. And as we begin to speak and to reflect about this wonderful mystery, let's take a moment of quiet, a moment of silence, to just allow our hearts to be open, to be in reflection, to be in wonder before the mystery that we'll be thinking, speaking, and wondering about. And so we call on all our gay and lesbian saints, all our brothers and sisters who've gone before us into liberation and communion, to be with us, to give us their love and their guidance in our speaking and in our listening, in our loving and in our learning, in our living and in our dying. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. So let me take a moment just to read to you a quote from Thomas Merton that perhaps sets the scene for this fifth session and also recaps some of what we considered in our last session, the desert and the dark. Merton says, "The death by which we enter into life is not an escape from reality, but a complete gift of ourselves which involves a total commitment to reality. For when Jesus said the kingdom was to be won by violence, he meant that it could only be bought at the price of certain risks. And sooner or later, if we follow Christ, we have to risk everything in order to gain everything." So let's consider some of those thoughts of Merton's as we move from the land of the desert, the land of the darkness, towards the land of liberation, the experience of freedom. This involves a total gift of who we are, a total gift of ourselves. And this has to be not just the false self, but the true self that we've come to know, even in just a small way through the darkness. It involves a commitment to reality. You know, often the spiritual life, particularly contemplative life, is seen as an escape, people running away to the convent, the monastery or the desert, escaping reality. And Merton's saying, no, it's nothing like that at all. In fact, it's a total commitment of the whole person who is become liberated, who is becoming free, who is becoming themselves. It's a commitment of that person to reality, to the truth of the human condition, to the truth of who we are, to the truth of our situation in the world and of what it asks of us. It also involves great risks. The spiritual life is not a cocoon where we can just be safe from any danger. Quite the opposite. The spiritual life is the risk of all that we are, of our whole life itself. And very often in living the spiritual life, we feel that our very life is on the line, and it truly is. It's also a place of hope, a hope that is in some ways unable to be grasped or even expressed, but it's hope which keeps us alive, keeps us going through the night. And it's the hope fundamentally in the coming of the kingdom, in the coming of the reign of God. And we'll talk a little bit about this later on, because the kingdom, the reign of justice and peace, is absolutely at the heart of all true human maturity, gay, lesbian or otherwise. And it's certainly at the heart of all Christian spirituality. This is not just a private, personal journey. This is a journey with profound implications for the whole of the world, for the whole of creation. It's not just my own liberation that is at stake. I'd like to just refer for a moment to the spiral nature of the spiritual life. Probably as we spoke about Exodus and awakening, as we spoke about the desert and the darkness, and now as we speak about liberation, there are things which will strike a chord inside you, things which will say, yes, I know something of that. And this is because the spiritual life is probably best imaged as a spiral, which begins and spirals down in ever decreasing circles until it finally becomes one. And as you spiral around, you are in fact going deeper, but you're also returning to the same place. If this side of the spiral, for example, were the darkness, this side were the light, you would be touching that place, but at ever deeper levels. So that whatever level we're on, when we hear the language of light and liberation, and when we hear the language of darkness and struggle and pain and death, we can relate to it because we all have some of those experiences in our lives. But it doesn't necessarily mean we are at the deepest level of darkness or at the deepest level of light. There are always more profound levels of liberation, more profound levels of letting go. At the same time, it is linear. We are going deeper all the time. And there are phases in that depthing. So there is a period when everything becomes one, when the darkness of the night of the soul, the darkness of spirituality, the darkness of activism, the dark night of action, when all that we do, all our work in the world, all our work for justice, for example, becomes empty and full of ashes and seemingly hopeless. And there are times when there's a dark night of sex, when our sexual loving, our sexual relating becomes empty too, and when there is a sense that we need to go somehow deeper even than sex, deeper even than prayer. And this is when all these different phases of who we are becoming one and going into a very deep part of the spiral, where we're seeking something that can't be grasped, that in a sense almost can't be experienced. And so you find people who have a lot of sex, people who have a lot of action, people who have a lot of contemplation, all saying the same thing as the spiral goes down, which is that somehow there has to be something more, something deeper. And this is when we really enter into the dark night, into the desert, into the darkness. All of this is really to say that we are becoming whole, that all these facets of our lives are really facets of the one person. And the call to wholeness, to liberation, is to me, to who I totally am, not just to my prayer life, not just to my action, not just to my sex. It's to all that I am. And as we go on, two questions, I think, become very critical. One is, why are we on this journey in the first place? What is the purpose of this? What's the point of all this, especially when it becomes intensely painful? Why bother? You know, there's a saying in Buddhism, better not to start the journey at all. But if you do, better to finish. But better not to start, you know, there's so much pain and struggle involved. And the other question is, once we have gone on the journey, what will sustain us? What keeps us going? What is our hope? What is the hope to which we're called? For a Christian, this always has to be seen in terms of the death and resurrection of Jesus. The death and resurrection of Christ is the central myth, the central paradigm of all Christian living, all Christian loving. We have to go through the death. There's no other way. And that is good news. Doesn't always feel like it, but it is the heart of the good news. This is an utter and complete surrender of everything, of all we thought we were and could be, into the love of God. For what? For what? What's the point of it? It's for the building of the reign of God. It's for the building of justice, peace, and freedom in my own life, in my own heart, and in all the world, not just for me. So this journey, this journey through darkness, through death, is profoundly political as well as personal. You know, one of the great issues and questions of spiritual life is whether it is something that becomes so private it has no implications in the political life of the world at all. And there are certain parts of our church that would much prefer to see us remain non-political. The fact of the matter is that someone who goes deeply into the dark night and who is becoming alive to the reign of God within their own body, within their own spirit, in who they are, is someone who is a profoundly political person, in the sense that they are becoming free and therefore dangerous. Therefore, all their actions, everything they do and are, all their relating, is about building justice and love and freedom, and has nothing to do with the values of the world as we discussed it in, I think, in our third session. Nothing to do with the values of the gods of our culture. An utterly free person. We think of Jesus, for example, who died in a very literal sense, but whose death was profoundly political, profoundly liberating. We think of Latin America, where more and more a religion that was very, very much in the sacristy has become an incredible force for change, so much so that certain governments, like Nicaragua, for example, are collaborating with conservative elements in the church to keep down this community movement of liberation that comes from the gospel. We think of people like Oscar Romero, for example, a profoundly political person because he himself became liberated in the spirit of the gospel. We think even of a mystic like John of the Cross, whose liberation, whose journey into truth involved him becoming imprisoned for months and tortured and flogged and starved. This is not just a private journey that we're on. In many ways, whether it's political or personal, it will feel like we're dying. Often it's obvious when people are, for example, being tortured in Latin America. It's not always so obvious when we're struggling for justice in the political climate of the United States, when we're, for example, going to the United Nations as two gay men did in Tasmania, in the country that I come from. It's not as obvious sometimes when we're sitting in our prayer, when we're going through our own sexual freedom and liberation. But often it does feel like we're dying. How else could it feel? The liberation is not always immediate. It's hard won. So all of this is to say there is no dichotomy between true spirituality and true action. True action which does not come from our own compulsions or our own ego, but comes from who we truly are and are called to be. This talk of building the kingdom, it's a very complex and subtle reality. I mentioned Nicaragua. I have a number of close friends in Nicaragua, both Nicaraguan and from the United States. And I remember sitting one night with one of these people in Berkeley over dinner discussing the situation in Nicaragua, which had become worse and worse and is still becoming worse and worse, and discussing what it means to struggle for the kingdom, what it means to believe that there could be liberation. And I told the story also for us who are in any way gay activists involved in the struggle for gay liberation, whether simply in our own bodies or in the world at large. And I said to her, Elena, it's not going to happen. It's really not going to happen. We've been struggling for the kingdom of justice and peace for 2,000 years, in one after another. And now we're struggling in Nicaragua, and we're struggling in the United States, and we're struggling in Tasmania, and we're struggling in all these countries around the world for gay liberation. In some true sense, it's not going to happen. And if it happens in this community, it'll be fragile and it may well fall apart. And if it doesn't, there will be other communities where we still have to struggle. This is our whole lives go into this. In Nicaragua, they say, maybe our struggle will bear fruit in 200 years' time, in our great-grandchildren's time. We hope it does. We can only give our lives for the struggle. So I said to her, in a sense, it's not going to happen. And in another sense, it's already happened. Because look at people like you, this beautiful, incredible woman sitting, across from me. Look at people like Rafael, leader in the older space community in Nicaragua. Look at Cecilia from way up in the desert parts of Nicaragua, who lives and struggles and reflects and prays and works with her community. These are the people in whom already the kingdom is alive. The risen life is already happening in them. The resurrection is in their flesh, in their lives. These people are the kingdom which is within us, as well as the kingdom we have to build in society. They are the guarantee of the kingdom. They are its presence already within us. They are the cornerstone of the building of the reign of God. They're our hope, our light in the darkness. So on one hand, the kingdom will never come, not in the way we would hope it would. On the other hand, it's already happening in our own lives. And both need to be kept in dynamic tension. We don't split off just into activism, that we don't split off just into my own private liberation. It's both personal and political. So truly in these people, and in our own ongoing struggle for justice. We experience the light which shines in the darkness, the light which the darkness was not, is not, and never will be able to overcome. And there are moments when we taste it. There are moments when we taste and see the Lord, the love, the freedom is good. And there is joy. There are moments of celebration. And if we forget that, if we forget to celebrate the freedom that's happened in our own lives, the freedom that's happening in our communities, the freedom that is happening whenever 2 or 3 people come together and commit themselves to the struggle for justice, if we fail to celebrate, in some sense we fail to realise the presence of the reign of God already with us. Let's taste, let's rejoice, let's share the beauty of the liberation that is already happening in us, in spite of the gods of this culture, in spite of the prisons and the dungeons, whether they're in Nicaragua or whether they're in our own lives, the dungeons that have kept us enslaved for so long. Let's celebrate when we manage to find freedom. In this process, however, I do believe that the contemplatives, the people who go out into the desert in very literal senses, those who do, in a sense, become stripped of all that one could hang on to, one could cling to, one could use to define oneself by. These people do have a very precious gift to offer to us in reflecting on what is happening in all of us in our lives. Not that their life or their journey is in any sense totally unique and esoteric. It's the journey of everyone. But in the sense that their greater freedom, their greater space, their greater quiet allows them to reflect and offer back to us insights into what it means to be free, what it means to come into this phase. Also, it's important to look at some of our models. I mentioned people like Romero before. Some might use Harvey Milk as an example. Certainly Pastor Doucet, the wonderful gay pastor who had a church for gay and lesbian people, for transgendered people, for prostitutes in Paris, and who was murdered by the religious right because of his activism to try and have the European court make statements about gay and lesbian freedom. People like that are our great models of what it means to go into death and yet in some way live in the liberation and the memory and the joy of the people that they have served. So we need these people, and most of all, of course, Jesus, to give us a sense of hope and a sense of what the journey is about. So at the same time, before I move on, I also want to say that some of our great models, I think, too, are people who've died of AIDS and people who've served people who are dying with AIDS. That in many ways these people have very literally walked the road of death, walked the road of absolute rejection, stripping away of all that they are, of becoming a pariah, a leper in our society, of those who serve giving up so much of their lives and their hopes to serve those who are dying, entering into death with them. And for so many of these people, we have seen that there is a true life, a deeper love, a greater freedom that comes, which was unimaginable before this journey began. And it in some ways still sounds like madness even when we talk about it. And these people too are our models, are our heroes, are our cornerstones of true liberation and true communion of love, which is not about just joyful ecstasies or personal mystical experiences, which so many people in the New Age seem to want. And I might add some of the people in the Old Age in Christian prayer seem to want. This is the liberation of love. This walking through the desert and the darkness together and finding somehow in the beaten downness, in the pain, in all the shit and the struggle, there is freedom, there is love, and there is joy beyond what we imagined. So, what is happening in the life and the heart of a person who is coming into this phase beyond the desert and the darkness? What few words can we say about this? It's difficult to talk about this as a gay man to other gay men and perhaps to lesbian women, because so little has ever been written about this, especially in relation to sexuality. You know, I got really angry a few months back because I was going through some of my own stuff around, you know, what it means to be authentic and to be on this journey and to be sexual. I thought, damn it, all these saints and all these mystics and all these people in every tradition And they have said so little about sex and how it relates to the journey of communion, of union, of liberation. So little. So we're kind of left to work it out for ourselves. Perhaps this is the gift of our age. Perhaps this is what our saints have to do. And we need saints. That's an invitation, and more than an invitation, a command. We need to become these saints who can do this work to pass it on to future generations. Because the old saints didn't do it, sorry. Or if they did it, they didn't write about it. So what I'm going to say is an exploration. It's just a tentative foray into possibly how you might think about this as sexual, gay and lesbian people. It's difficult also because this phase of its nature is inarticulable, and because of the limitations of language, and because of limitations of my own experience. But somehow we have to say something. I'd like to read a few verses from a beautiful old Quaker hymn, beautiful thing. I think this expresses almost as well as anything what is happening in the life of a person who has been through the desert and is coming into liberation. I'm sure you know the hymn. It's called How Can I Keep From Singing? Let's just listen to the words and listen to them as gay and lesbian people who are coming to liberation. My life flows on in endless song, above earth's lamentation. I hear the real, though far off hymn that hails a new creation. Through all the tumult and the strife, I hear that music ringing. It sounds and echoes in my soul. How can I keep from singing? What though the tempest round me roar? I hear the truth, it liveth. What though the darkness round me close? Songs in the night it giveth. When tyrants tremble, sick with fear, and hear their death knell ringing, when friends rejoice both far and near, how can I keep from singing? In prison cell and dungeon vile, our thoughts to them are ringing. When friends by shame are undefiled, how can I keep from singing? The peace of Christ makes fresh my heart, a fountain ever springing. All things are mine since I am Christ's. How can I keep from singing? No storm can shake my inmost calm, while to that rock I'm clinging. Since love is Lord of heaven and earth, how can I keep from singing? As I say, I know of nothing which expresses quite so beautifully what it means to be coming into this liberation. How can I keep from singing? It's grounded, it's honest. There is pain, tumult, strife, roar, and yet there is the freedom, there is the new creation. I hear it echoing in my soul. How can I keep from singing? In the midst of all the pain, how can I keep from singing? It's also political. Tyrants who hear their death knell ringing. Friends, even in dungeons, even in pain and in torture, who yet are free, who are unbowed. And because of them, how can I keep from singing? It's also the tasting of that spring. Remember we spoke in the second session about the spring of living water in sexuality and in spirituality, that as it grew deeper, flowed and became one. Finally, in this phase, that spring has become a fountain welling up to eternal life within our own heart, as Christ promised it would be. And we taste that water of freedom, that water of life, which is the divine life in our sexuality, in our spirituality, in our action, in our contemplation, in all that we are. And how can we keep from singing? So this person who's coming out of the darkness is hearing the herald, the song, the trumpet, the sound of this song of freedom in their own heart, in their own guts. But at the same time, it's like Israel coming into the land of Canaan. They won a few battles, and then they lost a few battles, and then they won a few more battles, and then they lost a few more battles. It's not all at once. Sometimes we expect, that we're going to come into the promised land and everything will be, rosy and fine, and we'll be happy, happy, happy. No, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, all the way. We make it, and then we fall back a bit, and we get a little bit of political clout, and we lose it, and we get a little bit of personal freedom, and then we discover how enslaved we still are. But we're getting there, little by little, poco a poco, as the Latin Americans say. And the most sure sign of this is that where there was deep pain, the pain we talked about in the desert and the darkness, now there is a deep sense of peace. The pain of being purified of all our mess and of all the false gods gives way to a quiet sense of peace. And in this peace, we are indeed touching bottom. In the midst of pain, and at this phase that I'm talking about now, as we're coming out of the dark, there is still pain. But we begin to touch a tiny seed, a tiny core, somewhere at the bottom point of who we are. We begin to discover a sense of who we are. And this is the pearl of great price. This is the kingdom hidden, the treasure hidden in a field. And there is the sense that no matter what it's taken in our life to reach this point of touching this fine point of bottom of who we are, it was worth it all. Even in the midst of struggle and pain, we're touching it, we're sensing the truth within us. Tentative? Very tentative at first. Merton says that the true self, which is who this is, hidden in God, is like a shy, wild animal that only peeps out and shows its face when everything else is quiet, at rest and silent. When all the noise and all the gods we've served, all the attempts to be someone, have become silent, the true self, like a shy, wild animal, begins to show its face. We begin to see it. We begin to get a sense of who we are. And Merton, in talking about this true self, very much is at one with Carl Jung, who said that he knew of no word or concept for the deep self which was not also a word or concept for God. And Merton says, I cannot hope to find myself, my true self, anywhere except in God. There is only one problem on which all my existence, my peace and my happiness depend. And it's not about defeating the gods of the culture. It's not about political activism, though that may be a fruit. The problem, the issue, is to discover myself in discovering God. If I find God, I will find myself. If I find my true self, I will find God. So as we let go of God, as we saw in the desert, we let go of God. We pray God to rid us of God. We go even into a darkness beyond God. What we do find is our true self, this tiny hidden core, fragile yet unmistakable. It seems to me absolutely crucial, absolutely central, that in this coming to my true self, obviously I absolutely have to come into my true sexuality, into the fullness of who I am as a sexual being. There can be no true self without that. And in fact, this, for a gay and lesbian person especially, but probably for anyone in our culture that has denied and repressed sexuality so much, coming into a full owning and living of who I am, rejoicing in who my sexual self is the royal road into the true self. Because it will cause us to destroy and throw away all the gods and the self-definitions that our culture throws onto us, all the stuff we have taken in and defined ourselves by. It will smash them and lead us through them if we will follow our sexual desires, our sexual needs, even our sexual fantasies. The truth of who we are as sexual beings will lead us to the truth of who we are as being. So there's no question here of in any way sexuality being peripheral. It is at the heart of coming into who we truly are. So slowly, tentatively, we come into this quiet, silent space. Still not free, still in pain, but becoming free. This tiny point which becomes our touchstone. And gradually all of our life will be referred to this touchstone. We'll see that as we go on. It's crucial here to have discernment as we hear this touch this tiny point. It's good to have help and someone to companion us in this journey. At times there is a profound joy in this. It's very quiet, it's very silent. It's a deep breathing from within. It's not yet celebration, but there's a sense, my God, I can breathe. At last I know what it is to breathe, deep in who I am. I want to read you something again of Merton. Merton's a great guide through this for modern people. I want to say, by the way, that I think a lot of the models and guides we've been given in this phase of communion with God, which is what this is about. A lot of the guides from the past, including the Middle Ages, especially the Middle Ages, they don't cut it anymore. Somehow they don't speak our language. Someone like Merton, I think, does. Merton says this, I love this quote. At the centre of our being is a point of nothingness, which is untouched by sin and by illusion. A point of pure truth. A point or spark which belongs entirely to God, which is not at our disposal. You know, if we tried to muck it up, to mess it up, we couldn't. From which God disposes of our lives, which is inaccessible to the fantasies of our own mind or to the brutalities of our own will. This little point of nothingness and of utter poverty is the pure glory of God in us. It is, so to speak, God's name written in us, as our poverty, as our sonship, as our daughterhood. It is like a pure diamond, blazing with the invisible light of heaven. It is in everybody, and if we could see it, we would see these billions of points of light coming together in the face and blaze of a sun that would make all the darkness and cruelty of life vanish completely. I have no program for this seeing. It is only given. But the gate of heaven is everywhere. This little point of nothingness, of absolute poverty, is the pure glory of God in us. How privileged, how gifted we are as gay and lesbian people. If we can go into our poverty, into our exile, into our rejection, into our nothingness, we can find this pure point of nothingness, this poverty, which is the brilliant diamond, the diamond of God's own life. I can't help but just reflect, I won't make a joke about it, but I can't help but reflect that our culture can bastardize even something like this, when someone like George Bush can talk about 1,000 points of light. What an obscenity. This is the 1,000 points of light that is true light, that is truly the life of God. The gate of heaven is everywhere. So, as we come into this, a deeper and deeper awareness of this point of light, this point of nothingness, as it comes to be who we are, what happens? I love this part. The first part is the one who was the exile. We've talked a lot about exile. The one who is in exile comes home. In fact, finds that he has been at home all along. The home within. This is a home which no one could ever give to us. The home which is us. We find we are not in exile. We belong. In Scripture it says, those who are called not a people, I will call my people. That's us. We were called no people, no one's people, the scum. And now we're called my people. The exile finds home deep within. And all the tentacles which we've sent out throughout the world, searching for home, searching for something to make us feel we are worth something, searching for love, searching for belonging, all these tentacles come home. And we find we are already there. It's already in us. And this belonging is a belonging not just within me, it's a belonging to all creation. I find that I also belong, I am also at home with every creature, with every being. No separation, no exile for anyone, for any being. Absolute belonging to all creation. And so this interdependence, this sense that I am part of this web, which is the whole of life, I have a place here, I have a right to be here, given to me by this God who is who I am. This beauty I see all around me, and it expresses itself in solidarity with all beings. Each of these realizations within has an expression in the world outside us, which is also profoundly political. And the expression outside us is solidarity. Solidarity with all beings, with every creature, with every human being. We know what the human condition is, and we share that with everyone, including those who oppress us. We share it also with all beings, and we are particularly in solidarity with all those who are most oppressed, who are most told they don't belong, who are most told that they are in exile, because we know that place so well. So they especially are the ones we are in solidarity with. Secondly, the one who was broken, the one who was fragmented, the one who was at war with himself, herself, especially the one who had been told that sexuality and spirituality had to be in absolute conflict with each other. This broken one becomes whole. This broken one becomes one and begins to taste union and integration. Gradually, all the fragmented parts of the personality start to come into unity around a single centre. And all the competing forces within us that wanted attention, that wanted to be served, whether it was ambition or career or so-called love or making it in some form, being someone, getting the right wardrobe or the right goods, whatever it was that vied for our attention and our energy, now comes into unity around the single centre and becomes subject to the true centre. This person is becoming whole. And each of those parts is welcomed and affirmed for its own goodness, its own beauty, and what it can contribute to the whole person. It's also a place then of great harmony. It's a place where we have a sense of justice, especially to those parts which were most degraded, most put down within ourselves. We now welcome them back within us and accept their gifts most reverently. They are the parts to whom we give the most honour now. And this will be expressed in the world as justice, as a concern for the good of everyone, but especially those who have been most oppressed and denied justice. Now we will see them as deserving the greatest honour, just as those degraded parts of ourselves, usually our sexuality, deserve the greatest honour now in this unified person, this unified whole. And in this there is a great sense of peace, great and deep sense of peace. The person is coming home, the person is becoming themselves, and they are becoming one. And I think in this phase of a beautiful story in Randy Schultz's book, And the Band Played On, where he traces the journey of one particular gay man in the Castro in San Francisco who develops AIDS. I can't remember his name. But a beautiful man who was well loved and had a lot of friends and did a lot of active work in the community. And when he first gets AIDS, he goes through this process of discovering what a beautiful spiritual teacher it can be. He's full of joy and delight at the expansion and lessons he's learning. Then he goes through this profound experience of death and darkness, where he says there is nothing beautiful about AIDS. It's ugly, it's disgusting, it's death, it's putrid, it's obscene. The awakening, and the desert and the darkness. And finally, when he's dying, Randy Schultz is saying that people are visiting his deathbed as if it were a holy shrine. And a friend goes in and talks to him and says, what is this? What's going on here? All these people are coming to you as if just being with you is like in somehow touching the holy. And this guy, who it's on his day of death, as far as I can remember, says, I finally get it. I finally get it. I am light, and I am love. And I transform other people simply by being myself. This is what this person is learning in this phase, to simply be himself. Thirdly, the slave, the one who was in slavery, that we talked about earlier, is becoming free. The one who is enslaved to society, to the church, to his family, to his own old sense of self, to dictate his values, his needs, his desires, his possibilities, what he could be, what he could not be. The one who relied on all these outside forces to judge him, to condemn him, to restrict, to punish him, and also to reward him, to give him carrots and make him feel better. Who relied on these outside gods to define who he is, to dictate who he could love, and how he could be loved, to tell him who God is and who God wanted him to be. This person is now becoming free. And all of that is coming from his own heart. No one outside now can tell this person what it means to live, what it means to love. This is the person now who is free. Now, this is not without dialogue. It's important there be dialogue with these outside forces as well, because there is some wisdom out there. We are not total laws unto ourselves. But the touchstone now is the free touchstone of the heart. And now the person is free to hear the call of the heart. This is the person who's coming into the phase where Augustine says, love and do what you will. That now there is the deep freedom within to do that and to be that responsibly, wisely, justly, lovingly. Not irresponsibly, not crazily or madly, but as the true person, truly free. So we need to stress that these false gods have been faced and confronted in society and in oneself. This is absolutely critical. The false gods, the internalized crap, is mainly in here. This is what really enslaves us. And so this is where the true liberation has happened, is happening. The person then is also becoming free of his addictions, of his compulsions, of his fears, becoming truly free. And this is expressed in the outside world as just that, freedom. You can't kind of pin this person down. You can't make him feel guilty. It's a beautiful thing. You can't make this person feel guilty. If there's guilt or shame, it can only come from within when the person feels they have denied the truth of who they are, which we're still capable of doing at any point. But you can't get guilt put on you from outside anymore. It's a quiet challenge, and sometimes quite a strong challenge, to people around us. Because someone who's free shakes you up, makes you face your own enslavement. And of course then in relation to the wider society, this is someone like a Romero. This is someone who cannot be cowed or beaten down, no matter what you do. There's a wonderful story which expresses the fullness of this freedom. It comes from Tibetan Buddhism, that in some attack on a monastery way up in the mountains, some guy broke through the gate and raced up to this very old monk with a lance or a sword drawn. And the old monk just simply stood there, quietly smiling. And the guy stopped in his tracks and got very aggressive and said, what's wrong with you, old man? Don't you realise that I'm the one who could run you through without batting an eyelid? And the old man said, and don't you realise that I'm the one who could let you run me through without batting an eyelid? This is a person who is free of guilt and free of fear. A very dangerous person. So they're the three key things I think are happening here. The exile coming home and expressing that in solidarity. The fragmented one becoming whole and one and expressing that in justice. The slave becoming free and expressing that in free action in the world. So underneath all this then is this profound journey, which is one, even though I've given it three, and I will give it yet another concept. And in the centre of this is deep, deep surrender. And there is also pain. Because what is happening, Rumi says, is like the spokes of a wheel. The true self is down here, like the centre of the spokes. And this centre is turning around, and the spokes are severing all attachments, cutting off attachments to all the old false gods and false values which enslaved us and made us a prey for the culture around us. And this is profoundly painful. This is not an easy process. And at this stage, the person is still feeling the rub, he's still feeling the cut. It's not easy, because we still long for so much of what the culture gave us, including what our gay culture gives us. And most profoundly, like Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, we don't really want to die. And yet we are dying. We know we will go through death, and we feel the pain of that. I want to say that this severing of attachments is also a severing of who we may have thought we were sexually. And so sometimes a person who may have become comfortable with one sense of being gay or lesbian finds that they need to go deeper into that there are issues and areas in their sexuality not yet plumbed, not yet depthed. And they have a lot to learn from people who they may have regarded as sexual outlaws, to walk in sexual ways that are frightening even for them. So this too can be a severing of the old sexual self we thought we had become comfortable with. Nothing escapes this turning around the centre of the self as the person is utterly freed. But this freeing is, as I say, a painful process. As this process goes on, there will be times when there is great struggle and great strain and tension in this, and there'll be times when the person feels as if the centre is not going to hold, as if one's going to lose it. Now, in the early stages of this process, occasionally one does lose the centre and then find it again, and then lose it again. But gradually the centre begins to hold, and in spite of the most painful moments of struggle and of purification, of letting go, of lostness, of confusion, of emptiness, somehow underneath it all, in the silence, the centre remains. It holds. And this is the most crucial stage. This is becoming an abiding reality within us. The centre now is not just something that shows its face every now and then. It is becoming a continuous presence. And we can continually sink down into it and use it as our touchstone all the time. So when we start to find, however obscurely, that in the midst of our pain and confusion, there is still this point which is present and we can access it. Not always with our mind, but somehow it's there. And it allows us to let go of things we would never have dreamt we would let go of, all our securities. And we know we will continue to do that. This is when the person is going deep in this spiral and coming into what can be called the unitive way, to use the old expression from Christian spirituality, coming into a subtle, embryonic union with God. It's being reached. And for those who are conversant with this terminology, I just want to say what we've forgotten a lot in Christian spirituality is that the unitive way is a way. It is not simply a state. One does not simply move from the dark night into the fullness of possession of God, to full union. One enters onto the road of the union of love with God, as John of the Cross calls it. It is a way. The person here now, with this subtle and abiding presence of the centre, which is freeing. Sorry, it's just coming up in me. It's freeing in ways we never expected it, and in ways that people around us find bewildering, amazing. How can you do this? How can you keep going in this way? There's no security. There's no 5-year plan. You're just responding to what comes from the centre. What they often forget is the pain of that, the insecurity of that, the challenge of that, to keep going to this place. Because this centre can still be denied. We haven't reached a point yet where the centre can no longer be denied. That will come later. But at this point it can be denied. So there is a constant challenge to go down into the centre and to be faithful to what it calls us to. In this phase then, one is becoming deeply receptive. Remember I said there's no 5-year plan? There's no sense of I'll get out there and I'll do it and I'll make it happen and I'll work it out. A lot of the writers here talk about the way of non-action, the way of passivity even, the way of receptivity and active passivity, where the person simply remains present and in some sense floats on God's bosom, as another writer put it. But floating, he says, is not drifting. Floating requires a certain kind of passive activity to remain afloat. It's not just drifting like a log of wood. There is a cooperation going on here, which is very challenging, very painful. So deeply receptive, a sense of passivity, letting go. In this phase, one realises one wouldn't know what to do anyway. One wouldn't know what to do. Recognising, I don't know where this is supposed to go. I don't know how to make the reign of God come. And recognising also at a deeper level, there is nothing to do. There simply is nothing to do. Now, I can't explain that. Those who have experienced that in however subtle a form know what I'm saying. This does not mean we don't work for justice. We do. We don't continue to walk the road. We do. And yet there is nothing to do. We can simply be. And we become, in this phase, we are becoming a human being, truly. Someone said, for a lot of people in Western culture, especially the United States, I think, we should talk about human doings, not human beings. In this phase, the person is becoming a human being, very truly. And I want to say that this receptivity, how can I put this without, in some sense it's physical. Anyone who's experienced any sense of contemplation knows that contemplation is gut. It's not really head or even in a sense heart, although the heart is certainly involved. It is gut. It's deeply physical. Contemplation is a physical act. Not only, but it is generally physical. And it involves our sexual centre. It involves our guts. It involves our anus. It involves all that we are down here, especially. And becoming deeply receptive here. Now, particularly gay men are going to hear a lot of sexual talk in what I'm saying. Deeply receptive. I think this is one of the gifts of gay men in this phase, that we can be receptive. It's not as agonisingly painful as it might be for straight men. It's still painful, but perhaps we have learned something about receptivity. Something which I do believe many women already know in very many ways, with that often a deep receptive capacity for the female, that we are experiencing that too as gay men. And I sometimes think this is a physical reality, literally, in that in a sense through our loving in physical ways, God is opening us up and making us more receptive to the penetration of God into our bodies, into ourselves, into our deepest centre, into our heart. Here one finds where one may have wished to penetrate God, now one wishes to be penetrated by God, to utterly receive God. And around this phase there can be a sense of plateau. One has reached this point, and where the hell do I go from here? What happens next? One can only wait and trust that somehow God will come into us, will respond to this deep receptivity that is also physical. So waiting, trusting, not knowing, being free, but feeling the pain, remaining in the darkness, asking, very important, that God will come into us. And one discovers, firstly, one thing, one cannot be open enough. In some sense, God has to do the opening. And now, all at once, the tables are turned. When we're at the moment of deepest receptivity, of deepest awareness that we can't even be open fully ourselves, yet asking God to come and be in us. So it's at this deepest point of receptivity, of vulnerability, and of knowing that we ourselves can't even be fully open. We need God to do that for us. And of asking. It's critical that we ask for this openness and this receptivity, as well as asking that God may fill us. At this point, suddenly the tables are turned. And what we discover is that the lover, the divine lover, is asking me, is asking us, is asking you to become the lover and to enter him, to enter God, to become the lover. And God becomes the beloved, the one who opens and receives us into his body. Calls on us to be the love. And I think here of a wonderful story that the monks on Mount Athos, their great desire is to become the one who is kissed by God. Beautiful image. But here, the one who desires that, finds that she is asked to become the one who kisses, the one who makes love to God. And this, I think, is most beautiful. This is the heart of it all. Because at this point in the journey, the one who was unloved, think about our story as gay and lesbian people, the one who was unloved is now loved. The one who was forbidden to love and told that his or her love was obscene, was an atrocity, was a condemnation to hell, this one is now asked for his love, is now asked for her love, is now asked to become the lover. The tenderness of the divine lover who enters into that deepest wound where we were told our love was shit, our love was sin. And now God asks for our love to enter into God. This is profoundly transforming. And at this moment, by the way, you may even hear it, we are having a thunderstorm around this room. So we praise God for the thunder and the lightning and the rain. This moment is profoundly transforming on all levels of the personality. And I want to read you a poem which is in itself a bit of a thunderstorm to our culture, to our church. It's very old and it comes from one of the greatest theologians and mystics of the Eastern churches, one of the greatest mystics in Christian history, called Simeon the New Theologian, who lived around the 10th century. And I invite you to hear this with juice, with your body, not just your soul, to hear this as a gay man, to hear this as a lesbian woman, to hear this as someone who is embodied in their sexuality. We awaken, that great term about spiritual enlightenment, we awaken in Christ's body. As Christ awakens our bodies, and my poor hand is Christ. He enters my foot and is infinitely me. I move my hand, and wonderfully my hand becomes Christ, becomes all of him. For God is indivisibly whole, seamless in Godhead. I move my foot, and at once Christ appears like a flash of lightning. Do my words seem blasphemous? Then open your heart to him, and let yourself receive the one who is opening to you so deeply. For if we genuinely love him, we wake up inside Christ's body, where all our body, all over, every most hidden part of it, is realized in joy as him, and he makes us utterly real. And everything that is hurt, everything that seemed to us dark, harsh, shameful, maimed, ugly, irreparably damaged, is in him transformed and recognized as whole, as lovely, and radiant in his light. We awaken as the beloved in every last part of our body. This is what it means to kiss God and to be kissed by God. And who is this Christ? Who is this Christ that I am asked to love, that I am asked to enter with my own body, make love to? Is this the royal bridegroom, as the Middle Ages would talk about him? The nuptial couch, the secrets of love? Is this the Christ of the church? Is this the cosmic Christ? So who is this Christ that we are asked to love? The Christ, I believe, I more than believe, that we are asked to love in our time is the crucified Christ. Not the cosmic Christ, the risen Christ, the royal bridegroom. We are asked to make love to the crucified Christ on the cross as he dies. To enter him in some ways with our body, certainly with our heart, and make love to him in that place of pain, of rejection, of being an outcast, being thrown away, in that place of dying, a place of anguish and abandonment. And in that place of pleasure is where we are asked to make love to Christ. Today is the feast of St. Francis of Assisi, as we are recording. I would like to show you an icon of Francis that comes from an old Spanish painting that has been reworked by a Jesuit priest in Albuquerque. So what we see in this icon, which by the way was painted by William Hart McNichols, who has done a lot of work with people with AIDS, is that he's taken this ancient painting by the Spanish master Murillo and he's transformed it, which is what has to happen for us in our time around loving Christ. We have to transform the old images into ones that will speak to our hearts today. Not just speak to our hearts, but challenge our hearts. So what we have here is Christ crucified, being embraced by Francis of Assisi. Now Francis, amongst other things, is always known for his passionate love of Christ, passionate love of the humanity of Jesus. He's often called the seraphic saint because his love for Christ was like the flame of a seraph. But it was a love for the physical human Christ who walked the earth and who cared for the lepers and who was crucified. So this image that Murillo gives us is very true about Francis embracing Christ. But the Christ we see in this icon is a Christ covered with Kaposi sarcoma, and a Christ who above his head has not Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, but AIDS leper, drug user, homosexual. Something in our day which is far more condemnatory, far more of an outcast than even those words accusing him of being the so-called King of the Jews. So what I think the icon painter is saying is that the lover of Christ today, and this person at this point in their journey is surely that, has to embrace the Christ who is the outcast, the reject, in physical ways, in very real ways, and make love to that person in their pain, in their suffering, in their rejection, and risk becoming one with them. You know, Francis, when he first embraced lepers, was terrified of becoming a leper, and the turning point of his life was when as a young man he first embraced the leper and risked becoming one. And here he is embracing, making love to the leper Christ and risking becoming one of those people, becoming the leper Christ himself. You also see in the image that Francis has wounded hands himself. So Francis shares the very wounds of Christ in his hands, in his feet, and in his side. When Francis received what is called the stigmata, the 5 wounds, he was the first person in history to ever experience this extraordinary phenomenon. It was towards the end of his life, and he had gone to a high mountain, and he prayed for 2 things. He prayed that he might receive, he might share in the suffering that Christ went through on the cross. The person at this stage loves so much that he or she no longer asks to be spared suffering. They are willing to accept suffering. And I think, as the love deepens to the love of Francis, they even ask to share in the suffering of Christ, which is the suffering of the world. The person now is not running away from suffering anymore. But he then also asked to experience the love that Christ had in his heart, that prompted him, that urged him, that forced him to go through that suffering for the whole of the world. And the answer was that he became himself one flesh with the crucified Christ. So this communion of love with the crucified Christ, which I absolutely believe has to have physical dimensions to it, it's the core of the most profound spiritual experience, but it also must have a physical dimension to it. This communion is a communion of love which makes the two one flesh. This is the ancient metaphor of marriage, which is what making love to the royal Christ used to use as its terminology, the mystical marriage. Well, making love with the crucified Christ is also marriage, and it makes us one flesh with him. And this means in some way in our own bodies we need to share, we will share, in the suffering as well as in the love. But the love is so intense now, we accept the suffering. Now, I want to say something about the nature of this communion and the nature of this metaphor of making love. This metaphor of making love has been castrated and stripped of all its sexual power. It's become some kind of refined thing that maybe some weirdo saint-type mystic stuff do way out in monasteries and convents somewhere. The point of taking up the metaphor of marriage, of sexual love, is because it is so passionate, it's so erotic, it is so immediate in its love-making, so immediate in its communion. Now, to take away that sexual dimension strips the metaphor, the image, of its whole power. And at this point in the spiritual life, while in the depth of the soul there is silence, the rest of the person needs images and metaphors to have some sense of what is happening to them. And what is happening to them is utter communion with Christ. Now take away the sexual power and the metaphor is dead. And the way I want to show that to you is this. In communion, in Holy Communion, when we take the host, the bread, which is Christ's body, into our bodies, that bread becomes physically part of who we are, part of our constitution. And through that we say that Christ has literally become who we are and we have become who Christ is. But friends, there is a more immediate physical communion which is possible. And that physical communion is love-making. And I want to talk about love-making as a gay man because I am a gay man and that's the only place I can speak from. In the love-making of anal sex, the entry of one body into another, the gay man goes into the inner sanctum, into the deepest part of the person, the Holy of Holies, but passes through that place which has been most shameful, most rejected, most called obscene and dirty. And it's in that very place that the love-making must happen, that the pleasure and the joy and the intimacy and the communion must happen with Christ and with ourselves. And in that place, which is the place of life, where nourishment is taken into our bloodstream directly, the place of death, where that which is of no use to us anymore, that which has died in us that we might live, is shitted away. In that place, there is no gastric juices to break down our presence. This is being very out there. Our semen, as we make love with Christ, passes immediately into Christ's bloodstream. Our body juices become him, and in a sense he becomes us. The communion is that intimate, and it happens in the place of deepest shame, of deepest hiddenness, and of deepest vulnerability for Christ and for us. All that was shameful, harsh, ugly, maimed, as irreparably damaged, now becomes holy, radiant, and light as we awaken as the beloved in every last part of our body. For if we truly love Christ, we wake up inside Christ's body, says St. Simeon, the new theologian. In this place, suffering and glory, suffering and joy are almost one. St. Teresa of Lisieux, who was dying of consumption at the age of 24, says, with no drugs, no medication, going through the deepest painful physical agony, says, in some way I can no longer suffer anymore because all suffering has become sweet to me. St. John of the Cross says, suffering matters nothing to me. Glory matters nothing to me. Only love, only love, only love. So in this place, the pain and the pleasure, the joy and the suffering are almost one in the fullness of love. And so we make love to the crucified Christ as he suffers and dies, age after age after age, in person after person after person who comes into our life. Now in this place, the person who is entering into this discovers and has discovered that she is empty of this love. This is the love he is called to, born for, that his whole being has been crying out for every moment of life and in every love-making he's ever experienced. But he finds he does not have this kind of love. And so he has to wait, she has to wait in silence for the love to be given to one's heart. And somehow in the waiting, what springs up is what John of the Cross calls the living flame of love. And this is the very love of God, the uncreated, immediate fire of God's love, welling up in the person's heart, which will love the person into Christ and unite the person into Christ and burn away all the dross of self and self-seeking and ego. Anything that's left will simply be consumed in this fire of love. And this is also the phase then in which this flame of love may burn through the person and send the person out into the marketplace again to serve and to love in the broken and the crucified Christ in literally physical ways. So there is this tradition in Christianity and in other religions that the one who has reached this peak of being transformed into Christ, or this depth of being transformed into Christ, is then sent back to wear out themselves in loving, in literal physical ways. This love, this entering into the darkness of Christ's body, is the deep communion of love which is the Trinity itself. As St. John in his Gospel says, anyone who loves me will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home within him. As we are united with Christ, we are united with God himself, with God herself, with the Father, Son and Spirit. We come into the very love of the Trinity itself. And this is the fullness of Christian mysticism, Christian spirituality. This communion of love is the source, the essence, the lifeblood, the destiny of all that is created, of everything that has ever existed. This is its destiny. This communion of love needs no justification, needs nothing to make it worthwhile, needs to do nothing. This communion of love is its own purpose and its own end, and it exists only to generate and to draw everything and everyone into a deeper and deeper communion of love. In this communion of love, each person, Father, Son and Spirit, is equal, distinct, seeing fully the one in the other, so that ultimately in love there is only one being. And here the person who's come on this long journey, this beautiful journey of death and resurrection, of love, of life, is truly sharing in the divine nature, as we read in the letter of Peter. The person is becoming divinized. God became human so that humans might become God, says St. Irenaeus. And in the Mass we read, may we come to share in the divinity of Christ who humbled himself to share in our humanity. This is what is happening in this person, in this gay and lesbian person who has gone the full journey. At length, even beyond this communion of the Trinity, one is drawn into the absolute silence and void of God, beyond even the Trinity. As Eckhart tells us, there is a silence and a ground of being, a wasteland and a void, even beyond the Trinity, and it's there that the soul finds its final resting place. What is left to say? Sex in this period? Who knows? Honest to God, who knows? I would suggest that, like prayer in this period, it's becoming our teacher, it's becoming our guide, it's becoming a way of truth, of honesty, of simple communion with other human beings, of finding our integration. It also grounds us in our humanity. Our sexual urges and loving and relating helps us not to spin off into some kind of ethereal, mystical trance state. It makes us physical human beings, as Christ was, as Francis was, as the love is and must be. Keeps us present to ourselves and to other people. We are human beings. Our sexual relating, I think, rather than becoming fireworks, I think it becomes not so much ecstasies, but very simple, very clear, very present. A simple and deep being with the other person in communion. And of course, it has to become increasingly reverent, recognizing Christ and God in the other person and in myself. So the sexual relating becomes deeply reverent, and it leads increasingly to a deeper and deeper communion of love. Love comes up and opens the heart more and more in whatever sex we have in this phase. Ultimately, of course, it will all become the communion of love. This, of course, harks back to the discernment points we gave in our second session around growth in sexual loving. Two final points. It seems to me that if we want a theology of gay loving, theology of gay sexuality, a theology of gay unions, whether monogamous or polygamous, we have to look to this communion of love coming through intimacy with Christ into the communion of love, which is the Trinity. You know, there are wonderful theologies of love for heterosexual marriages. I think here we can find a profound theology of love in gay loving, in gay relating, in gay unions. It is the communion of love, where all are co-equal, seeing the beloved in oneself and oneself in the beloved. A union of love which generates, but is fundamentally its own end, its own purpose. It doesn't exist to make children. It exists to be the communion of love and draw all things and every person into the communion of love. This is a theology for gay sexuality, for gay loving. So I'd like to end with a very simple, beautiful story that comes from way back in the 12th century. It's a story of St. Francis and St. Clare. We tend to think we know who Francis was. He was this wonderful, passionate, strong, earthy man, deeply in love with all creation, who also was profoundly sensitive and creative. So he had a great blend of the masculine and the feminine energies in him. Clare was his alter ego. She was a woman who followed Francis and lived a life of deep poverty and surrender as a nun in one of the little churches that Francis had rebuilt when he first began his ministry. Chiara means light or clarity, and she certainly was that. So she lived as a contemplative nun, enclosed the whole of her life, probably never travelled outside the monastery itself, living a very simple life of prayer and hiddenness. And yet Francis saw her as the best embodiment of all that he was trying to be. And they saw each other as twin flames, twin loves, and were deeply in love. But Clare was also a very strong, very clear woman who could sort of stop armies in their tracks, as she did at one point in her life, and was called on later as an older woman for advice by popes and emperors. A very strong woman. So she also combined the masculine and the feminine energies very beautifully in herself. And the story is, and it's probably just a story because we believe Clare never left her monastery, but the story is that Clare, just before Francis died, went down to have a simple meal with him, down in the forest, at the tiny little church in the middle of the valley below Assisi, to have a meal and to share last meal with Francis before he died. And they were sitting there, and Francis prepared the meal on the bare earth, as was his custom. And they sat down and prepared to have their meal. And Francis began to speak about the love of God. And as he spoke, his heart became inflamed and on fire, and Claire's heart came on fire, and they both fell into an absolute ecstasy of silent contemplation and presence with God, a silent communion of love, a silent meal of love. And there they stayed for several hours. Meanwhile, up in Assisi on the hill and in Spoleto, the nearby town, the people looked down and they thought the whole forest was on fire. They saw flames leaping up above the church and flames above the trees, and hundreds of them dashed down the hill to put out the fire and save the forest and save this little church that they loved so much. And when they got there, all they found was Francis and Claire, absolutely united, in one, in a total communion of love, perfectly at peace, and yet their love lighting up the world like an immense fire of passion. That is what we are called to be. That is the kind of love we are called to. At times it will be ecstatic and absolutely passionate. At times it will be surrendered, empty, dry, and a pouring out of ourselves. But it is our call and our birthright as human beings and as gay and lesbian people, as sexual lovers. And my friends, were we to reach this phase, this communion of love, and surely we are all on the journey, then truly what cornerstones we will be to build the reign of God in the world, the reign of justice and peace for all people, for all beings. Truly in us, in our lives, the stone which the builders rejected will become the cornerstone of the kingdom of God.